The dragon had destroyed 17 star systems in 3 weeks. Its scales were darker than the void between galaxies, and its eyes burned with a fire that made suns look cold. When it moved through space, reality itself seemed to tremble. Planets cracked under its roar. Moons shattered when its tail swept past them. The greatest military powers in the known universe had thrown everything they had at the creature, and nothing worked. Plasma cannons melted before touching its hide. Quantum missiles vanished into nothing when they came near. Even the ancient weapons of the first civilization, tools that could unmake matter itself, did nothing but anger it further. The Galactic Council met in emergency session for the 5th time that month. Representatives from 1,000 worlds gathered in their floating chamber, speaking in hundreds of languages through translation devices. Fear hung in the air like smoke. The dragon was moving toward the core systems now, toward the most populated regions of space. Billions would die if it continued, perhaps trillions. Some delegates suggested evacuation. Others wanted to try negotiation, though no one knew how to communicate with something that seemed beyond reason. A few whispered about surrender, though to what or whom no one could say. Admiral Kelthros of the Andromedan fleet stood before the council, his 4 arms spread in a gesture of helplessness. His species had fought in 100 wars across 5,000 years. They knew battle like humans knew breathing. But this was different. "We hit it with the full force of 3 battle groups," he said, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. "We lost 60 ships. It lost nothing, not even a scratch on its hide. It didn't even seem to notice us." "What about the Seraphs?" asked Counselor Vex, her tentacles coiling nervously. The Seraphs were energy beings, ancient and powerful, capable of existing in multiple dimensions at once. They had ended wars by their mere presence. They had stopped the Void Plague 3 centuries ago when nothing else could. "They tried," Kelthros replied. 7 of them surrounded it in the Terminus system. "They're gone now. Just gone. We don't know if they're dead or scattered or imprisoned." The dragon consumed their light and continued on its path. Silence fell over the chamber. If the Seraphs had failed, what hope did anyone have? On a small blue planet in a quiet arm of the Milky Way, a boy named Thomas didn't know about any of this. He was 10 years old, with messy brown hair and a gap between his front teeth. He lived in a town so small it didn't appear on most maps, in a house at the edge of a forest. His mother worked at the local library. His father had died 2 years ago in an accident at the factory. Thomas had learned to be alone with his thoughts, to find comfort in small things. The way birds sang in the morning, the smell of rain on dry earth, the feel of his old dog's fur under his hand. Thomas had a gift, though he didn't think of it that way. Animals trusted him, they always had. When he was 5, a wild fox had walked right up to him in the backyard and let him pet it. His mother had watched from the window, afraid to call out in case she startled it. Last year, a hawk with a broken wing had landed at his feet. He'd carried it home and nursed it back to health. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had said it was a miracle the bird hadn't attacked him. Hawks didn't like people, but Thomas knew differently. The hawk hadn't been afraid because Thomas hadn't been afraid. Fear, he understood, was a language all its own. He didn't know that humanity was unique in this way. The other species of the galaxy had conquered space through strength or intelligence or technology. They had built great civilizations through logic in order, but they had lost something along the way. The ability to feel without thinking, the capacity for pure empathy. Humans were young and strange, barely night by most of the galaxy. They had only just developed faster than light travel. Most species considered them primitive, even cute in their simplicity. But humans carried something ancient inside them, something from their origins as social creatures on a wild planet. They could look at another being and feel what it felt. They could touch and heal. They could love without reason. The dragon entered Earth's solar system on a Tuesday morning. Its arrival bent the fabric of space so violently that every sensor on every satellite screamed warnings. NASA's Deep Space Telescope caught a glimpse of it and immediately classified the footage. The thing was impossible, too large, too real. It defied physics just by existing. Emergency protocols activated across a dozen agencies. The president was woken at 4 in the morning. Within an hour, the world's governments knew that something terrible was coming, though they didn't yet know what. By the time the sun rose over Thomas's town, the dragon had passed Mars. It was moving slowly now, deliberately. Military forces scrambled. Missiles were armed. Fighter jets took to the skies, though everyone knew they would be useless. Earth had no defenses against something like this. The planet had barely begun to explore its own star system. It had no energy shields, no quantum weapons, no way to evacuate even a fraction of its population. Thomas was eating breakfast when the emergency broadcast interrupted his mother's morning radio program. He looked up from his cereal at her face, saw the color drain from her cheeks. "Mom?" he asked. She turned up the volume with shaking hands. A serious voice spoke about an unidentified object approaching Earth. People were advised to stay in their homes, to remain calm, to stay away from windows. The broadcast repeated over and over. His mother pulled him close. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, but Thomas could feel her heart racing. He wrapped his arms around her and tried to think calming thoughts, the way he did with frightened animals. She was scared. The voice on the radio was scared. The whole world was scared. Thomas could feel it like a pressure against his chest. The dragon settled into orbit around noon. It coiled around the planet like a snake around an egg. Its body so vast that it blocked the sun across half the Earth. Darkness fell over entire continents. The temperature began to drop. Scientists calculated that if the creature stayed where it was, the planet would freeze within days. Crops would die. Power grids would fail. Humanity would end not with fire, but with endless winter. World leaders tried everything they could think of. They sent radio signals, mathematical proofs, images of art and music, prime numbers, chemical formulas. The dragon ignored it all. It simply hung there in the void, its massive eyes fixed on the small blue world below. Occasionally it would shift, and earthquakes would ripple across fault lines from the gravitational distortion. Once it breathed out, and the solar wind carried the heat of its breath past the moon, scorching ancient craters into glass. The Galactic Council finally decided they had to intervene. Earth was a protected world under the Treaty of Emerging Civilizations. Humanity didn't know it yet, but they had been watched for centuries, studied, kept safe from hostile powers. Now the Council sent an envoy, a crystalline being named Zael, who could survive in any environment. Zael approached the dragon in a small ship, broadcasting messages in every known language and some unknown ones. The dragon looked at the ship with eyes like dying suns. Then it opened its mouth and released a stream of plasma that would have vaporized a moon. Zael barely escaped, her ship melting as she jumped into hyperspace. "It won't communicate," she reported back to the Council. "It doesn't want to negotiate. I don't think it's here to destroy Earth, though. It's waiting for something, guarding it maybe, or hunting something on it." "But what?" Counselor Vex demanded. "Humans have nothing that could interest a cosmic entity like this. They're barely beyond their own planet." No one had an answer. The dragon remained, and Earth began to freeze. Thomas's town lost power on the second day. The temperature dropped to freezing, even though it was supposed to be summer. His mother wrapped them both in blankets, and they huddled by the fireplace, burning furniture when the firewood ran out. Outside, Thomas could see his breath in the air. Birds fell from the sky, frozen solid. The forest went silent. His dog Max pressed close to them for warmth, whining softly. Thomas stroked his fur and whispered that everything would be all right, even though he didn't believe it. On the third day, something changed. Thomas woke from a dream that felt more like a memory. In it, he had been flying through space, vast and powerful and utterly alone. He had been searching for something he'd lost so long ago he could barely remember what it was. The loneliness was so deep, it felt like dying. The anger that came with it was like fire burning inside him, burning and burning until there was nothing left but rage and the need to destroy anything that reminded him of what he'd lost. When Thomas opened his eyes, he understood. The dragon wasn't a monster. It was hurting. It was lost. And somehow, in his dream, it had reached out to him across the distance and the cold, showing him what it felt. Thomas didn't know why. He didn't question it. He simply got up, pulled on his winter coat, and walked to the door. "Thomas, no," his mother said, reaching for him. "Where are you going? It's freezing out there." "I have to help," Thomas said simply. He looked at her with eyes that seemed older than they had been yesterday. "Something's hurt and alone. I have to try." She wanted to stop him. Every instinct she had screamed to keep her son safe inside. But she looked at his face and saw the same expression he'd worn when he carried that hawk home, when he'd befriended that fox, when he'd gentled every frightened creature that crossed his path. She saw her husband in him too, the man who had never walked past someone in need, who had stopped to help strangers change tires in the rain, who had believed that kindness was never wasted. "I'll come with you," she said finally, her voice breaking. Thomas shook his head. "You can't. It has to be me. I don't know why, but it does. I'll come back, Mom. I promise." He hugged her tight, feeling her tears on his neck. Then he opened the door and walked out into the frozen world. The streets were empty. Ice coated everything. Cars were buried under snow that had fallen from clouds, formed by the dragon's breath cooling the upper atmosphere. Thomas walked through it all, his shoes crunching on frost, his breath clouding in the air. He didn't know where he was going exactly, but he could feel a pull, like an invisible string tied around his heart, drawing him forward. North, out of town, toward the old meadow where he used to play when his father was alive. By the time he reached the meadow, his feet were numb and his face ached from the cold. But he kept walking, following that pull. Above him, the dragon's form blocked out half the sky, so enormous that his mind could barely comprehend it. He could see the individual scales, each one the size of a building. He could see the slow rise and fall of its breathing, the occasional flicker of flame between its teeth. It was terrifying and beautiful at the same time, like a storm made flesh. Thomas stood in the center of the frozen meadow and looked up. "Hey," he called out, his small voice swallowed by the cold air. "Hey, can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dragon moved. Its massive head turned, and one enormous eye focused on the tiny figure below. Thomas felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. He felt the anger in it, the ancient pain, the loneliness so deep it had curdled into rage. He felt all of it, and he didn't run. He opened himself to it the way he did with frightened animals, letting the dragon feel what he felt in return. Compassion, sadness for its pain, the wish to help. No fear, only love, offered freely with no expectation of anything back. The dragon descended. It moved slowly, carefully, its body uncoiling from around the planet. Ships in orbit watched in stunned silence as the creature that had destroyed star systems began to lower itself toward a small, frozen meadow on an insignificant world. The Galactic Council's monitoring stations tracked every movement, trying to understand what was happening. Military forces around the world prepared for the end, certain that the dragon was about to strike. But Thomas just stood there, waiting. The dragon's head came down through the clouds, larger than mountains, wreathed in flame and shadow. The ground shook as it approached. Ice melted in a radius around it, turning to steam. The air shimmered with heat. Still, Thomas didn't move. He tilted his head back, watching as the dragon's face filled his entire field of vision. Its eye was the size of a house, burning with a light that should have blinded him. Its teeth were like towers of obsidian. One breath from those jaws would turn him to ash. "You're hurting," Thomas said quietly. "I can feel it. You've been hurting for so long you forgot what it's like not to hurt. I'm sorry. I'm sorry no one helped you before." The dragon went completely still. For the first time in millennia, the fury in its heart paused. This small creature, this fragile being that could be destroyed with a thought, wasn't trying to fight or flee or bargain. It was offering comfort. It was acknowledging pain that the dragon itself had almost forgotten was there beneath the rage. In all its long existence across all the worlds it had known, nothing had done this. Nothing had simply cared. Thomas took a step forward, then another. He walked right up to the dragon's massive jaw and reached out his hand. His palm touched scales that were harder than any substance humanity had ever created, that had withstood the fury of stars and the weapons of empires. They were warm. He could feel the life in them, the pulse of something ancient and powerful. "It's okay," Thomas whispered. "You're not alone anymore." And then he did something that no warrior or sage or scientist in all the galaxy had thought to do. He stood on his tiptoes, leaned forward, and pressed his lips gently to the dragon's scales in a soft kiss. A gesture of pure affection, given without thought of reward or survival or consequence. The kind of kiss a child gives to a hurt animal to make it better. Simple, innocent, filled with every bit of compassion his small heart could hold. The dragon's eye widened. The fire within it flickered and changed. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The frozen world held its breath. The watching galaxy waited. Then something impossible happened. The dragon, the terror that had laid waste to civilizations, the creature that had made gods flee, began to weep. Tears of liquid light fell from its eye, each one striking the ground and melting the ice, bringing warmth back to the frozen earth. The tears flowed and flowed, a release of grief so old and deep that it had become cosmic in its scale. Thomas put both arms around as much of the dragon's jaw as he could reach, which wasn't much. He held on tight, letting it feel that someone was there, that someone cared. The dragon lowered its head further, gently, carefully, until Thomas could rest his forehead against its scales. And there they stayed, a boy and a dragon, while the world watched in wonder and terror transform slowly into something else, something like hope. The dragon's body began to glow with a soft golden light that was nothing like the harsh fire it had shown before. The light spread across its scales, rippling like water, and wherever it touched, the darkness seemed to lift. The cold that had gripped the planet began to ease. The sun emerged from behind the dragon's coils as it shifted position, no longer blocking the light. Warmth returned to the air. Ice started to melt, and the dragon, still weeping tears of light, wrapped itself carefully around the small meadow in a protective circle, its body radiating heat that felt like summer afternoon. Around the world, people emerged from their shelters to find the temperature rising, the sky clearing, the impossible darkness lifting. Satellites showed images of the dragon in its new position, no longer threatening, curled around a single spot in a quiet rural area. Scientists scrambled to understand what had happened. Military leaders stood down their forces, confused but relieved, and in monitoring stations throughout the galaxy, beings of 1,000 species watched the feeds from Earth and struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. A human child had done what armies couldn't, not with weapons or technology or even intelligence, with something simpler and more profound, with kindness, with empathy, with the pure, uncomplicated love that humanity carried in its bones, inherited from ancestors who had survived by caring for each other in a dangerous world. The galaxy had forgotten that such power existed. Most species had engineered it out of themselves millions of years ago, considering it inefficient, illogical, a weakness to be overcome. But humans had kept it. They had carried it with them from caves to cities to the stars. and now it had saved them. Thomas stayed with the dragon as the day wore on. He talked to it in simple words, telling it about his life, his mom, his dog, his father who had died. He told it about the forest and the animals there, about how his favorite food was grilled cheese sandwiches, about how he liked to read books about faraway places. The dragon listened, its great eye never leaving him. It didn't speak, not in words, but Thomas could feel its thoughts like warmth in his mind. Images, emotions, memories of worlds long gone, of others of its kind who had died or disappeared, of loneliness stretching across eons, of forgetting, slowly, what joy felt like. "You can stay here if you want," Thomas offered. "Earth's not so bad. We have good sunsets. And forests. You'd like the forests, I think. Lots of space to rest." He paused, then added, "And I could visit you, if you wanted. I'm pretty good at sitting quiet with animals." The dragon's thoughts rippled with something that might have been amusement, might have been gratitude. It shifted its massive body, creating a small warm cave with its coils, sheltering Thomas from any wind. The boy smiled and sat down in the dry grass that was starting to grow again in the dragon's warmth. He felt safe. More than that, he felt like he'd found a friend, even if that friend was the size of a continent and could destroy worlds. His mother found them there as evening approached. She'd walked the whole way from town, driven by fear and hope in equal measure. When she saw Thomas sitting peacefully in the dragon's coils, alive and smiling, she nearly collapsed with relief. The dragon's eye turned to her, and she froze, every instinct screaming danger. But then she saw how its gaze softened when it looked back at her son, and she understood somehow that her boy had done something miraculous. "Mom," Thomas called, waving, "come meet my friend. It's okay. It won't hurt you." She walked forward on shaking legs, driven by her love for her son, and found herself standing in the presence of a being that defied comprehension. The dragon regarded her with an ancient intelligence, then dipped its head slightly in what she somehow knew was a gesture of respect, of thanks. This small human had given her the gift of a child who saw pain and chose to heal it, who faced terror with compassion. The dragon recognized the source of that strength. That night, the three of them stayed in the meadow together. Thomas fell asleep, curled against the dragon's warm scales, his mother beside him. The dragon kept watch over them through the darkness, and for the first time in longer than it could remember, it did not feel alone. Above them, the stars came out, brilliant and clear, and the galaxy turned in its slow dance, forever changed by a moment of simple kindness. By morning, the world had transformed. News crews had arrived, kept at a distance by military cordons, but close enough to film the impossible scene. Thomas woke to find himself at the center of a global event. Representatives from every nation wanted to speak with him. Scientists wanted to study what had happened. Religious leaders called it a miracle. Philosophers debated its meaning, and still the dragon remained, peaceful and calm, its massive presence no longer threatening, but somehow protective. The Galactic Council sent another envoy, this time approaching openly with a message of peace. A small ship landed in a nearby field, and Counselor Vex herself emerged, her species form shifting to something more comfortable in Earth's gravity. She approached the dragon and the boy carefully, all her senses telling her she was in the presence of something extraordinary. Thomas stood to greet her, polite but uncertain. He'd never seen an alien before, didn't know they existed. "Hello," Vex said in perfect English, her translation device working flawlessly. "I am Counselor Vex of the Galactic Council. I represent 1,000 worlds, and I have come to ask what happened here. How did you calm the Devourer?" "The what?" Thomas asked, confused. "The dragon," Vex clarified, gesturing to the massive creature. "We have called it the Devourer. It has destroyed 17 civilizations. We thought nothing could stop it." Thomas looked up at the dragon with surprise. "Really? You did that?" He felt a ripple of shame from the creature, a wave of regret. "Oh," he said softly, You were just hurting. You didn't mean it, not really. You were looking for something." "Looking for what?" Vex asked, fascinated and disturbed in equal measure by how easily the boy communicated with the creature. Thomas was quiet for a moment, listening to thoughts not his own. "Others like it," he said finally. "It's the last one, the last of its kind. It's been searching for thousands of years, getting more and more angry and sad, until it couldn't tell the difference anymore. When things reminded it of what it lost, it destroyed them without thinking." He looked at Vex with serious eyes. "It's lonely. Have you ever been so lonely it made you mean?" Vex had no answer to that. Her species had eliminated loneliness through constant neural connection. They were never alone, never isolated from the chorus of their people's thoughts. But looking at the dragon, at the way it curved protectively around this one small human, she thought perhaps her people had lost something important when they'd engineered away the ability to be truly separate, to feel the ache of solitude and the joy of connection that came after. "How did you calm it?" Vex asked. "What weapon did you use? What technology?" "I kissed it," Thomas said simply, "and I told it I was sorry it was hurting." Vex stood very still. In all her centuries of life, across all her years of studying emerging species, she had never heard of anything so simple having such power. "That's all?" "That's all," Thomas confirmed. "Sometimes that's enough. Animals just need to know someone sees them, someone cares." "But humans do this?" Vex asked. "This is normal for your species?" Thomas shrugged. "I guess. I mean, we hug people when they're sad. We take care of hurt things. It just seemed like what you're supposed to do." Vex turned to look at the dragon, which had been following the conversation with its ancient gaze. She spoke in a language older than most stars, one the council used for formal occasions. "Great one, is this true? Did simple compassion succeed where all our weapons failed?" The dragon's response came not in words, but in a wave of feeling that washed over everyone present. Affirmation, gratitude, a sense of having been lost and found. It had not been defeated or conquered. It had been healed, at least partially, by the one thing it had stopped believing existed in the universe: unconditional kindness, offered freely by a being that had no reason to give it except that it saw pain and wanted to help. Vex returned to her ship and composed a message that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. In it, she explained what had happened, how the terror that had defeated the combined forces of the Council had been calmed by a human child with nothing but empathy. She included the recordings, the scans, the irrefutable evidence. She explained that humanity possessed something that had been lost to most species: an ability to connect emotionally with other beings, even ones vastly different from themselves. An instinct for compassion that didn't require logical reason. The council debated for days. Some members argued that humanity was dangerous for this very reason. If they could reach across such vast differences, if they could change the unchangeable through sheer emotional power, what else might they do? Others saw opportunity. Perhaps humanity could mediate conflicts that had raged for millennia. Perhaps they could heal wounds that logic and force had failed to close. But Counselor Vex argued for something else. "Leave them alone," she said. "Protect them, yes. Guide them if they ask. But don't try to shape them. Don't make them like us. They have something we lost, and the galaxy needs it. Let them grow in their own way, in their own time. And perhaps when they join us among the stars, they'll teach us to remember what we forgot." The council agreed, though reluctantly for some. Earth would remain protected but uncontacted, at least officially. Humanity would discover the galaxy in its own time. And when it did, it would bring something precious with it. On Earth, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after the world learned it wasn't alone in the universe. The dragon remained in the meadow, which became known as Dragon's Rest. Thomas visited every day after school. He brought books and read to his massive friend. He brought his mother, who learned to feel comfortable in the creature's presence. He brought Max, who was terrified at first, but eventually dozed peacefully against scales that radiated perfect warmth. The dragon didn't speak, not in the way humans understood speech, but Thomas learned its language of emotion and image. He learned about worlds that had died before Earth was born, about civilizations that had risen and fallen like waves, about beauty and loss on scales he couldn't fully comprehend. And the dragon learned about human things, about birthday parties and baseball games, about homework and hurt feelings, about the small joys that made life worth living, even when it was hard. Scientists studied them from a distance, trying to understand the bond. Psychologists wrote papers about interspecies communication. Physicists measured the strange energy that seemed to flow between boy and dragon. But none of them could quite capture what was actually happening. It was simpler and more complex than they imagined. Two lonely souls had found each other. That was all. That was everything. Thomas grew older over the years that followed. He became a teenager, then a young man. The dragon remained constant, unchanging, a fixture in his life like the stars above. Other humans began to make contact with it, carefully, guided by Thomas. The dragon allowed this, though it never bonded with anyone else quite the same way. But it let children play in its coils. It warmed hikers who got lost in winter. It became a guardian of sorts, watching over the small community that grew up around Dragon's Rest. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The dragon began to heal. The rage that had driven it for eons faded like morning mist. The loneliness eased. It would never stop missing its kind, but it learned to find peace in new connections. In the small human who visited faithfully, in the other creatures of Earth who grew brave enough to approach. It learned that family didn't have to be what you were born to. It could be what you chose. The story spread beyond Earth, carried by the few who knew the truth. Other species heard about the dragon that had been calmed by kindness. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others wondered if perhaps they had been wrong to eliminate sentiment from their cultures. A few, the wisest perhaps, began to study human psychology, trying to understand this strange ability to reach across impossible divides with nothing but compassion. Thomas eventually went to college, studying biology with a focus on animal behavior. He was offered positions at prestigious universities, opportunities to travel the world. But he always came home to Dragon's Rest, always spent his evenings with his oldest friend. The dragon didn't age as humans did, but it changed in other ways. Its scales grew brighter. Its eyes held less pain. It dreamed differently, Thomas thought, better dreams. By the time Thomas was 20, first contact was made official. The Galactic Council revealed itself to humanity, and Earth joined the greater community of worlds. It was chaotic and frightening and wonderful. Humans spread to the stars faster than anyone expected, driven by curiosity and ambition, and that fundamental desire to connect. And everywhere they went, they brought their strange gift with them. The ability to empathize with the other, to feel and heal, to offer kindness first and ask questions later. Some conflicts were solved by human mediators who could help both sides understand each other's pain. Some species found themselves changed by friendship with humans, remembering emotions they thought they'd outgrown. And slowly, very slowly, the galaxy became a bit gentler, a bit more compassionate, because humans showed that strength didn't have to mean hardness, that survival didn't require cruelty, that the most powerful force in the universe might be the simple willingness to care. The dragon became a symbol of this new age, the devourer that had been defeated not by weapons but by a kiss. Images of it circled the galaxy, its massive form curled protectively around the small blue world that had given it peace. Other humans, inspired by Thomas's example, began to reach out to other dangerous or misunderstood creatures. Not all successes were as dramatic, but enough worked that it became clear humanity had a genuine gift. They were healers and bridge builders, able to touch hearts that others couldn't reach. Thomas's mother watched her son become famous, a symbol of humanity's potential. But she never forgot that cold day when he'd walked out into a frozen world with nothing but his compassion and his courage. When he'd looked at something terrifying and seen only pain that needed healing. That was her boy. That was what made him special. Not uniquely special, she came to understand. Most humans had that potential inside them. They just needed the chance to use it, and the courage not to let fear win. On quiet evenings when the visitors had gone and the news crews had packed up, Thomas would sit with the dragon and just be present. Sometimes they would watch the sunset together. Sometimes Thomas would talk about his day, his worries, his hopes. The dragon would listen and share its own thoughts, memories of ancient sunsets on dead worlds, hopes that perhaps the universe was kinder than it had believed. They didn't need words for this. The bond between them ran deeper than language. It was the connection of two souls that had found each other across an impossible distance and decided to hold on. Years passed. Thomas grew into adulthood, got married, had children of his own. The dragon remained, now a part of Earth's landscape, like a mountain or an ocean. His children grew up playing in its coils, unafraid, learning from their father that compassion was strength and kindness was power. They brought their own friends, and those friends brought more. And slowly a generation grew up for whom the dragon was just part of life. A guardian, a friend, a reminder that understanding could bridge any gap. The dragon never forgot what Thomas had given it. In moments of stillness, it remembered the cold meadow and the small hand touching its scales, the gentle kiss that had broken through millennia of pain. It had destroyed worlds in its anguish, and one small human had looked at it and chosen to offer comfort instead of running. That moment had changed everything. It had reminded the dragon that the universe, for all its cruelty and loss, still held beauty, still held connection, still held hope. Other survivors from dead civilizations began to emerge from hiding, drawn by the story of the dragon's healing. They came to Earth, these ancient beings carrying their own pain. And humanity, still young and naive in many ways, welcomed them, listened to their stories, offered what comfort they could. Not all were healed as dramatically as the dragon, but all found something on Earth they hadn't expected. Understanding, acceptance, the simple willingness to acknowledge pain without trying to fix it or flee from it. Earth became known as the haven, a place where the wounded came to rest. The dragon was its guardian, and Thomas its first shepherd, though he never liked that title. He was just doing what felt right, he always said, just treating others the way he'd want to be treated. It was that simplicity that made it powerful. No grand philosophy or complex theory, just basic decency extended to everyone, regardless of how different they seemed. The Galactic Council eventually established a permanent embassy on Earth, a gleaming structure near Dragon's Rest. Counselor Vex served as the first ambassador, having grown fond of humanity in its strange ways. She learned to appreciate things her species had lost: the joy of a shared meal, the comfort of a hug, the way humans could sit in comfortable silence together, just being present. She wrote extensively about human culture, and her papers became required reading for all council members. Understanding humanity, she argued, was key to understanding the future of the galaxy. Because humanity was spreading, and everywhere they went, they changed things. Not through conquest or domination, through connection. They made friends with species that had been enemies for millennia, simply by listening to both sides and helping them see each other's perspective. They found common ground where others saw only division. And while not every human had Thomas's gift, enough did that it made a difference. The dragon watched all this from its meadow and felt something it hadn't felt in eons. Pride, perhaps, or hope. This small world had given it peace, and now it was giving the galaxy a chance at peace too. All because one small human had been brave enough to kiss a monster and kind enough to see past the terror to the pain beneath. Thomas lived a long life by human standards, though it was barely a blink to the dragon. He grew old, his hair turning white, his steps slowing. But he never stopped visiting his friend. Even when he needed a cane to walk, even when his children had to help him make the journey, he came to the meadow. The dragon would lower its great head, and Thomas would rest his wrinkled hand on scales that hadn't changed in all those years. They would sit together in the twilight, two old friends, and remember the day they'd met, the day everything changed. When Thomas finally died, peaceful in his sleep at the age of 87, the dragon grieved. Its sorrow was so profound that it could be felt across the planet, a wave of loss that made even those who'd never met Thomas weep. The dragon coiled tighter around itself, dimming its light, and for a moment the galaxy held its breath, afraid that the healing had been undone, that the devourer might return. But Thomas's children came to the meadow, and his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. They came and placed their hands on the dragon's scales and shared their own grief. And they told it what Thomas would have said, that love doesn't end with death, that the connections we make outlive us, that it wasn't alone and never would be again. The dragon understood, and though its grief remained, it didn't turn back to rage. Thomas had taught it a better way. Earth built a monument where Thomas had first kissed the dragon, a simple stone with words carved in every language of the galaxy. He saw pain and offered kindness. He faced fear with love. He taught us all to be better. People came from across the stars to visit it, to stand in the place where a boy had changed the universe. The dragon guarded it faithfully, an eternal sentinel watching over the memory of its first friend. Centuries passed. Earth grew into a major power in galactic affairs, not through military might, but through its role as mediator and healer. Humans served as ambassadors, counselors, peacekeepers. They brought their gift of empathy to 1,000 worlds. And always, at the center of it all, the dragon remained at Dragon's Rest, a reminder of where it had started, a symbol of hope that no pain was beyond healing, no loneliness beyond connection, no being beyond redemption. The galaxy learned, slowly, that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't energy or matter or even time. It was the simple, profound decision to care about another being's suffering, to reach out across the void and say, I see you, I understand, you're not alone. Thomas had shown this to the dragon, and the dragon had shown it to the galaxy. And the universe, vast and ancient and often cruel, became just a little bit kinder because a boy had been brave enough to kiss a monster and gentle enough to heal its heart.